Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
This week we've got more on Brexit and the course the Mayor Sadiq Khan wants to steer these next 2 years. Then a little later, a look at the dimensions of our homes. It's a question of space. Why the need for new homes in a congested city is getting developers to think small. Here with me, thinking big, of course, Stephen Hammond, Conservative MP for Wimbledon, and Dawn Butler, Labour MP for Brent Central. Welcome to you both, and let's start off with the news late this week of the Evening Standard getting a new editor.
With so many big issues in our world, what people want are authoritative facts, good analysis, great news journalism. It's a really important time for good journalism, and the Evening Standard is going to provide it.
What did you think of that appointment?
Well, I'm stunned by that appointment. I mean, he's not qualified. He's not a qualified journalist to have such a huge role. But when I first heard it, I thought, well, OK, fine, there'll be a by-election. And then I hear there's not even going to be a by-election. So he's going to have 3 jobs, all well paid, one of them £13,000 a day, one that he's not even qualified for. I mean, that is privilege in all its forms. And I just think, is it good for London? Is it good for the Evening Standard? I'm hoping he won't be biased, Osborne, when but he's not a journalist. So how does it work? How can you get a job as an editor of a major newspaper and not be a journalist? How does that work?
So you approve of that appointment. Then, Stephen Hammond, there is life after being Chancellor.
Well, clearly, I mean, George is an extremely talented individual. I think it is a surprise to a lot of people. But against that, we in London need as many people to stand up for us as we can. And I think that George will ensure that's true. People forget, of course, he has a big hinterland of interest beyond just politics. So he's always been a huge supporter of the arts, huge supporter of infrastructure. And so those sorts of things are things that... Yeah, but so those are key things that Londoners need and key things the Evening Standard will do.
Do you think
and as to this charge of bias, I think that both the Evening Standard, who wanted a high-profile editor and have got one, and also George would recognise, they're not going to fall into the stupidity trap of being biased. So I think a lot of this is going to be overstated.
Yeah, what's the... I mean, presumably, if people are expecting the Standard to continue to steer the same impartial and unpartisan, political stance, he will... he'll want a surprise, won't he?
Well, I mean, it's not impossible for him to be neutral in his reporting, but I just don't know how he will fit that all in. He's an MP. That takes up a lot of time. If it doesn't, then he's doing something wrong. He has another job on top of that, and then he's going to be editor of the Evening Standard. How will he fit
Well,
it
he
in?
says, he was saying to staff on Friday that, of course, he'd put London first. If it's good for London, he'll say so. If it's not, it won't be. So we can expect him to be entirely fair with Sadiq Khan, the Labour Mayor of London.
Well, I think, if anything, it's probably quite good news for Sadiq, because he'll want to be over-fair and may well overcompensate. Some of us actually worry it's going to let Sadiq off the hook a bit, actually. So I think this is an issue. I understand that his comments to staff on Friday were extremely impressive. And I also think that if you look at... We all know who the political reporters of the Evening Standard are. They do a great job. I can't imagine George is going to get involved with that.
So, Dawn Butler... tell us that George Osborne is a good editor, but do it in sign language.
He's an editor.
Oh.
You'll have to get somebody
How do you do the word? How do you do the word good?
You'll have to... This is good. This isn't good.
And you're not giving me... What's bad? What's bad?
Bad is this.
The reason why I bring that up. The reason why I bring that up, of course, is because of this and you in the House earlier this week.
Will the Minister agree... Sorry. The 18th of March marks the 14th anniversary since the UK government recognised British Sign Language. Will the Minister...
Slightly hesitant there, though. You nearly had to look down at your notes.
I was nervous. I was really nervous.
How did you learn? I haven't read anywhere how you learned, why you got involved in it.
So I learned it sort of 20 years ago because I worked with somebody who was deaf, and she'd always used to accommodate us, and I thought we need to be more accommodating. So I learned sign language. I did it up to level 2, and it was great, actually. We had great fun. I could translate.
Were you in the House? Did you see her doing it?
I didn't see it, but... I think that probably even more people have seen it because of being in the House. I think it's extremely impressive. It's the right thing to say. And I hope the government gave her a good response.
And by a quirk of fate, we had you on the programme this week, so we're delighted. Let's move on. The Mayor was grilled by MPs this week on how he's going to steer the capital through Brexit. In City Hall's response to the government's initial Brexit blueprint, Sadiq Khan said access to the single market was crucial. EU nationals here should have their status clarified immediately, and an interim plan was needed in case no trade and regulatory deals are in place in 2 years' time at the point of departure. Here's Tanjil Rashid with a summary.
The government's Brexit bill has passed, clearing the path for the Prime Minister to trigger Article 50 and negotiate Britain's exit from the EU. But here in London, many are concerned about what will come of those negotiations. These protesters are angry about the government's refusal to guarantee the rights of EU nationals to stay.
We're talking about people who've contributed to this society, who are married to British people, who have British children, and they should not become pawns in Theresa May's game.
1 in 10 Londoners were born in the EU, and they're particularly prominent in the capital's construction and financial services industry. They are at the heart of City Hall's response to the government's Brexit white paper, in which the Mayor calls for a cast-iron guarantee to EU nationals before negotiations. Other demands include more powers for London over the allocation of work permits in the capital and continued access to the single market after Brexit, unless and until a new trade agreement with the EU has been reached. That would require what's being called an interim deal, as Sadiq Khan explained to Parliament's Brexit Committee on Tuesday.
Why not err on the side of caution and have an interim deal, should it be the case that less than 2 years we've not reached a deal with the EU, so in 2 years and 1 day, rather than falling off the cliff edge, by the way, a phrase used in the white paper, going to WTO terms, we have an interim deal.
But will World Trade Organization rules be as catastrophic for the capital as he says?
I think in the medium term, if anything, under WTO rules, the City of London could do better than if it has a trade deal with the EU, which might constrain it in some sort of way. If we weren't akin to the EU regulations, we could deregulate, become more competitive, and actually become more globally relevant than we are now.
It'll be 2 years of negotiations before we know for sure.
Dawn Butler, the point MPs were making, or some MPs were making, Sadiq Khan, during that session, was that, you know, why talk about what's the point of creating kind of interim deal, because that kind of gives away, it weakens your negotiating position if you're talking about that. There's going to be a deal, it's no problem.
No, it doesn't weaken your negotiating position in terms of... I've always been taught that if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And I think what Sadiq's doing is saying, we need a plan. We need a plan, because Theresa May says that... you know, she won't do a bad deal. No deal is better than a bad deal. Well, actually, no deal is a bad deal. And in order for London not to collapse, needs to have an interim deal so that it doesn't fall over the cliff edge, so that businesses can feel confident in doing business in London and not, as they are currently doing, talking about moving out of London. And that's the problem. If we move businesses out of London, remember, you know, business is the, you know, is the capital. It's, you know, where economy grows. Can you imagine if that was to collapse?
Any danger of firms moving out of London?
Well, clearly there is a danger, but that's exactly why Philip Hammond, David Davis and the Prime Minister have all said the same thing, which is broadly saying what the Mayor said, which is that we need to do two things in our first part of negotiating. One is to guarantee the rights of EU citizens here. But by the way, I think that what the Home Secretary has said about putting that into the Great Repeal Bill, their rights, guarantees it, and it does, although we all want to see the reciprocal deal. And secondly, Philip Hammond, David Davis and the Prime Minister all said we recognise we need transitional arrangements because it may be difficult to get a deal within 2 years. And I think a lot of people think that may be true. And therefore, as the Prime Minister said, we want to avoid the cliff edge. And that's why we need these transitional arrangements in place.
Is the Mayor pulling it off at the moment? Did he wants to create the impression? So he's a half-glass-full kind of person. He respects the vote of the mandate of the people, but at the same time, been quite critical about about, you know, the status of EU workers, the lack of an internal deal, what he might be doing to city firms in terms of...
You know, I suspect Dawn and I both voted the same way, which was to remain. But that's gone, and we're not fighting that battle anymore. We are going to leave the European Union. The key now is how we leave, and we want to make sure that there's a good deal, and a good deal for London. And therefore, I've been doing a lot of work with financial services industries to make sure that the negotiating position that would be good for them in terms of access, potentially looking at passporting, a regulatory equivalence regime. The government understands those, and I'm pleased to see that that's going to be at the forefront.
You're
of
doing a lot of that work, are you? You're trying to say, you're making that case on behalf of firms.
Well, I stood up at a big meeting, a London Market Group for Specialist Reinsurance, 10 days ago to launch their Brexit negotiation. I'm doing several things with other people behind the scenes.
Now the decision has been made. Tell me, the positive thing, tell me just how good the capital is going to be in 3, 4, 5 years' time and its financial sector.
Well, the key thing for us now, and I think the key thing for all London MPs, and indeed the government, is to stand up and start and fight fire with fire.
But what is going to be good now? Tell us now, though. What do you think?
If you just 1 second, Tim.
No.
But we've got to first of all, we've got to say London is still going to be the best place to do business if you want to do all sorts of industries, be it high-tech, financial services. And we need to stop other countries and other companies coming through London trying to wean people away. And that means, you know, a big focus from London, the Mayor and the government, to talk London up. I think we need to then negotiate hard. And I think, don't forget, you know, there is quite a good reason why London is so successful and so powerful, and it's because that there are all those infrastructure and what they now call the economic ecosystem around industries in London. And it's very difficult to replicate that anywhere else. And what one is beginning to hear quietly is that certain other places realise that, and it may well be to the benefit to find some areas of mutual interest.
Dawn Butler, how are we going to make this work then? How's it going to make the capital a really good place in 5 years' time?
Well, 40% of US companies in the UK are already talking about leaving or moving parts of their organisation or business outside of the UK.
So what are we going to do about it to stop them doing that then? How are we going to counter that?
Well, we have to have this transitional deal. And the transitional deal kicks in, and after 2 years, if Theresa May hasn't negotiated a deal that's better than what we have now, which is extremely unlikely, Tim, then that's when it kicks in.
So you're not being half-glass-full at all, and you're saying it's disastrous. You're taking a different position from the Mayor.
No, I'm saying that we need to have a solid plan, because you have to have stability in the market. Because, you know, 1 million people from the EU work in London. They need stability. The organisation needs stability. So what we say, look, the Prime Minister's going to be negotiating for 2 years. She's going to try her very best. I believe she will. And then we'll see what else she can negotiate after that. Okay. And I think that's a fair point.
Fair enough. OK. London is one of the least densely populated metropolises in the world, but the desperate need for more housing may soon change that. At City Hall, there are plenty of discussions going on at the moment about whether we should be building more densely. Andrew Cryan reports.
Not many major cities' public transport systems run through green, open fields, but ours does. In fact, Botany Bay in North London is something rather special. The people here get to enjoy more open space than in any other part of the capital.
Now, this is the least densely populated part, not just of London, but possibly any major city in the world. There's just 123 people living here in every square kilometre. Now, there's a very good reason for that. This is protected greenbelt land. You cannot build on it. What that means for the rest of London is that because you can't expand around the capital's perimeter, the pressure everywhere else is growing.
When large sites do become available, like around Battersea Power Station, the pressure is on. More and more homes are being squeezed into what little land we have.
Now, developers, of course, want to make money, but they're also under enormous pressure from the politicians, who are trying to build as many homes as possible to deal with London's housing shortage. The result is that sites like this are going to be built with incredible density, the type that London has never seen before.
Mill Harbour, just south of Canary Wharf. It's the most densely populated part of the UK, and by some way it's 9,000 times as dense as the corner of Enfield where we started this film, and it's even 10 times as dense as what you see in Hong Kong.
This, I think, is the pattern of the future, and not only in inner and central London now. If you look in places like Wembley and Harrow even, you begin to see not things quite as dense as this, but things that are beginning to look more like this. The downside is that you do end up, and certainly have here, with sometimes, if it's not really beautifully designed, quite gloomy properties that overlook each other. and it feels crowded. And for many people, obviously not the people who live here, but for many people, this area would probably feel a bit overdeveloped. I mean, certainly compared with much of the rest of London, it feels quite different.
In fact, an amazing 47% of London is green open space. Parks, woodlands, back gardens, the lot. Much of the rest is houses. Rows and rows of them.
The sorts of properties that people like living in and stay living in through all the phases of the development of their family tends to be the approximation of a house. It's got a front door, it's got a street, it's got a little garden. They just like that. They're infinitely flexible. The Victorian house is a very high density thing, but it's flexible. It can adjust itself. It can become offices, it becomes shops if you like, but it can be used in all sorts of different ways.
But houses aren't what's getting built. Another vision altogether is being put into action by a developer called Pocket Living. They're making hundreds of flats sized just 400 square feet and sell for an average £250,000. Not everybody, they say, is after a house and a garden.
That is not the view of people in their 20s, their 30s, their 40s, who are absolutely critical to the London economy. And they want a different kind of housing. They have fewer possessions, they want to get into the centre of town faster, they want to have buildings that meet their particular needs. So I think actually the garden may be for a slightly outdated view.
But whatever your opinion, London is getting denser and denser. Welcome to our future.
Our future. Andrew Boff, Conservative Chair of the London Assembly Planning Housing Committee, so you're scrutinising what the Mayor's doing here. Is that the future? Is it inevitable?
It's certainly not inevitable, and I think you'll find a general consensus on the London Assembly of all parties that sometimes we're letting developers get away with things. And actually the kind of housing that Londoners actually want is, as was indicated in the film, if you ask them, most Londoners want to live in, say, a nice, terraced house with a door that opens out onto the street and a garden at the back. And curiously enough, people say that's impossible now. Curiously enough, if it's 3 or 4 stories, that's a very dense form of housing, and as dense as trying to build up and up and up all the time.
But yeah, it's denser than people imagine, but it's not dense enough to answer the housing needs of the capital, is it? Where's the land?
Nothing will be dense enough. I mean, the trouble is in London is we're stuck with a political boundary that was based upon the travel to work area of the 1950s. It doesn't represent the economic area that covers a lot of the southeast. And GLA Conservatives, we've been arguing for a long time that the government needs to ramp up the idea of garden cities in the southeast to solve the problems of the southeast. It's not just London's housing problems. If you go to other parts of the southeast outside London, they've equally got problems. We have to start building again, and we have to start giving the opportunities for people to develop.
But what do you want to see in terms of the building being done in London to meet most of its current population needs, both in inner and outer London? Are the right kinds of buildings realistically being built in both outer and inner London?
Clearly they are not, and we saw an example the other day in both Harrow and Haringey where the Mayor granted permission. In fact, he called in 2 applications, one for a 21-storey tower block, another for a 17-storey tower block, where parties of all colours were against those applications. The Mayor called them in and granted those applications. They are, and I mean, this is just another Sadiq promise that he's dropped, because during the election campaign he said that tall buildings would not be granted permission if they weren't generally in local character for the area, and these are clearly not in the vernacular style of the area.
Dawn Butler, do we just accept that we have to go that kind of dense, small, and we're having to think about options like this? So grave is the problem.
I think that we have to solve the housing crisis, and to do that means that you do have to build up so that you can have more capacity. I think the style of the property is important. I think the size of the property is important. But I also think fundamentally it's the cost, because there's no point in building these tiny little box places for people to live in, and they're paying as much as they would for a house. Wembley was mentioned in that clip. There's loads of high-rise buildings going up
around the stadium and everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's and the infrastructure as well. That's what concerns me, is that there has to be the infrastructure to support the people living there, and it's not just travel. It's doctors, it's shops.
Stephen Hammond, do you think we should be building a little bit more big and high and dense in places like Wimbledon and outskirts of London? Need to take their fair share.
Well, I think everyone needs to think about how it's going to meet the housing area, but it doesn't all need to be skyscrapers, as Andrew said. You know, you could perfectly well have, as there's a big regeneration going on in my area around South Wimbledon, plans for that. And the maximum height, there is a mixture of all sorts of things, but up to 7-storey mansion blocks, which will fit in well with the local area. Also a number of townhouses, a number of smaller blocks. The other key thing, though, in London, as Dawn has made and Andrew had made the point, is we need to be building more. And part of that is we need to get the London Land Commission really working on bringing more of that public land back. And we also need to get local councils using the power with developers for permission in principle. And so we get these things built. And the other great thing that happened in the autumn statement was allowing housing associations to build 10-year free. Just get on and build.
Take those two ideas, 30 seconds left, wrap up. In a few years' time, where should we be? It sounds to me you might want everything, but we've got to house a lot of people here.
Yep.
There isn't a room. The land isn't affordable enough to build housing.
Some of the social problems of London are actually hidden. One of the biggest social problems in Dawn's constituency is overcrowding in properties. You do not, and there are over 300,000 young people being brought up in overcrowded households. You do not solve that issue by forcing them into tower blocks. And one of the most astounding things that came out of our interrogation of the Mayor's plan is that he has done no research whatsoever into the health outcomes of different types of building, and they are profound.
And you'll be making sure that he does in due course. Andrew Boff, thanks very much indeed. Now, very quickly, time for the rest of the political news. Well, in 60 seconds.
The Public Accounts Committee has said too much money has been paid for the land and buildings needed for new government-funded free schools. Chair Meg Hillier MP said in her constituency of Hackney South and Shoreditch, civil servants had purchased the former police station for £7.6 million, even though it had been valued at £3 million 6 months previously. A coroner has demanded an urgent investigation into the safety of cycle lane blue paint after linking 2 deaths to slippery surfaces. Transport for London has been warned there is a risk that future deaths will occur if it does not take action over the low grip surfaces. A deal aimed at ending the dispute between Southern Rail and the ASLEF union over driver-only trains has been agreed. Govia Thameslink Railway said both sides had secured a recommended deal after constructive talks. The result of the vote will be announced on the 3rd of April.
Stephen Hammond can answer this one because of the short time available. Free schools, it costs an awful lot to try and find space for these things, doesn't it?
Well, we know that any type of school that you're trying to find, it's difficult to find space for new schools in London. I'm seeing that in my own constituency. I mean, clearly that is a staggering. I think that we need to look very carefully at why that scale was overpaid. But I mean, there will be some value coming through at the end. But we also need to look at the definition of value of public buildings. And the fact that they could be taken out of non-use into use quicker means that we ought to perhaps look at how the pricing of these buildings is undertaken.
Thanks very much indeed. Say goodbye, Dawn. Say goodbye. Sign goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Andrew, back to you.
I've been getting